Hey, ViolarulesReacts here. Happy Halloween to everyone. Today I'm going to be reacting to the Month of Macabre project by Sparrow 9642 called Conflicts Between Dusk and Twilight. It's an MLP Fanfic reading. It's a grimdark that Sparrow wrote for the occasion. And I don't want to get too much into it because I do know what the story is. I was one of the artists for this project. And this video has two different endings to it because the story has two different endings. And what I'll do is at the end of the main plot, I'll put a link in the end card to the two different endings, and you can go and check out my reaction to those in that. So, well, we're about to start here in 10 seconds, so let's go ahead and do this. I did decide to do the premiere for this one as well, because I might as well watch it while everybody else is. Just like before, with the Month of Macabre project, it always has Scribbler's intro at the beginning. The following story takes place in an alternate universe. Anything non-canon is considered to be irrelevant. Yeah, I figured it would be obvious that it's an alternate universe story, considering that, well, actually that would be a spoiler. I actually can't say that yet. No. I don't know whether or not to really consider this to be a blind commentary, because I'm an artist for it, so I know the story and everything. I guess it's blind in terms of the fact that I don't know how it was edited together. I also don't know how long this project is, because I don't think the premiere shows you the timestamp for the original video file, so we'll just go. Sparrow said to bring snacks because it's going to be a long one. I don't know how long, but apparently it's going to be extremely long, I guess.
In the courtyard of Canterla Castle, the aspiring students of Princess Celestia went about their business, socializing and sharing knowledge with one another. It was a beautiful day within the royal capital city of Equestria.
The first chunk of
many
it was
tunes in the
my
many trees
for
across the large clearing of vegetation, and the city sprawling with both the nobles and lower-class ponies alike. All except for the young unicorn, Twilight Sparkle, occupied in her own little area with a book hiding her face from the rest of her classmates. No pony paid her any attention, knowing that she preferred to be alone, rather than associating with any pony else. Something that most of the others found bizarre, but at the same time really didn't bother to care about.
That is something I like about this story. It takes a lot of the stuff that is canon and uses it in the story to sort of enhance it.
As a result, earning Twilight both a bad reputation and giving any other individuals a hint that she preferred to be alone. Therefore, the young unicorn sat under a shaded tree, accompanied only by the book shielding her face, a notebook, and a lone drink off to the side. She was currently enveloped in a piece of literature about advanced magic, taking notes on the many spells and how to perform them. Twilight had an obsession with magic, and everything to do with the subject itself. And while she struggled with even casting the simplest of spells, she was more than determined to learn everything she possibly could.
Yeah, I feel like
learn
that's
about
canon
magic
for Twilight, because she didn't really pass the entrance exam if it hadn't been for Rainbow Dash's Sonic Rainbow, and she would have failed.
She refused any
but
sort
she
of
probably
help
did
from
struggle
any of her
after.
classmates, or even the princess herself. Princess Celestia herself had eyed Twilight's demeanor and actions towards her other classmates, and had found it sad and very depressing on how one of her top students preferred to go about her goals so lonesomely. On top of that, she had her own challenge to deal with, her current protege. Sunset Shimmer, a very talented and determined unicorn that had exceeded her expectations during her years of attendance at her school. While Sunset was talented, there was one problem with her that matched Twilight's preferred introverted lifestyle. Both of them were focused more on knowledge and less on socialization with any pony. Just like Twilight, Sunset spent more time in libraries than out and about with both her classmates and the citizens of Canterlot, wanting to learn more and more on how to expand her talents with magic and much more. Celestia had tried to address Sunset on the matter, but she merely ignored it, feeling like she didn't need friends, being the protege of the Princess of Equestria. She already had all she needed, so why would she need friends? She only saw it as something that would get in the way of her goals, just like Twilight did. That was enough for Celestia to resort to a plan that would solve the problem with both of the mares, killing 2 birds with 1 stone.
I still don't understand why you're making me do this,
said Sunset, standing alongside her towering mentor.
My student, you have been focused on one thing for too long.
Celestia started, eyeing her protege with a kind expression.
Personally,
if you ever plan to expand your knowledge, you must be willing to learn from others, not just literature books.
But it's not my
What
problem.
makes you so confident that I'll learn anything from her specifically?
Sunset questioned indignantly.
She's one of my most successful students, Sunset.
Celestia replied.
This is a really good VA student.
Much like you, she only wishes to learn all that she possibly can, but refuses to try learning from others. I feel that you two can benefit from one another, even if it's only for the sake of knowledge.
Sunset groaned in ignorance, knowing she had no choice in this matter, holding a look of disapproval on her face.
Ugh, fine. I'll try talking to her.
Sunset responded in an annoyed tone.
Very good.
Celestia responded simply.
I expect a legitimate attempt as well. As much as a report on what you learned while associating with her.
And if she refuses?
Sunset questioned.
She won't. Now off you go, Sunset.
Celestia stated. Sunset obeyed, slowly walking from the castle entrance, down the staircase, and out into the courtyard. Upon noticing the princess's protege out in the open, glances from Celestia's other students were exchanged. Sunset felt as if she were being spotlighted upon her approach towards Twilight, making her fruitless attempt to achieve Celestia's demands all the more uncomfortable, especially considering who she was walking towards. She practically had an audience, coming to a stop right in front of the lavender unicorn buried in a world of literature and notes. Sunset took a moment to pause and think of how to even get Twilight's attention, her demeanor seeming awkward and unsure.
Style.
The golden-clad mare took a deep breath inward and took her best shot at starting a conversation.
Excuse me.
Sunset murmured, her tone seeming choked and uncomfortable.
Someone in the chat just asked
Her
if
selfless
Sunset's
attempt
in
to get
Malibu.
Twilight's attention had worked,
Of course not.
the book lowering and revealing violet irises, her
Okay,
face
now
holding
back to
a
your
look
hiding.
of annoyance.
What do you want?
Twilight spoke with mild irritation.
I'm kinda busy with something.
Sunset tried to find words,
I like
but they
the
seized in
kill
her throat,
Twilight.
and she expressed an awkward smile that caused Twilight to even raise an eyebrow. A long moment of silence passed between the two, the golden-clad mare only continuing to hold the same awkward and unusual smile that made her appear as a crazed mare.
Look, if you need something, pick up the pace.
I don't
Twilight
think
demanded.
repeatedly doing the pan thing was
Sunset
necessary.
jumped, not expecting Twilight to be such a hasty and demanding individual. The words finally escaped Sunset's throat, coming out more objective than she had intended.
Look, I'm no happier to be in this predicament as much as you, so give me a break.
Twilight raised another eyebrow, eyeing Sunset with curiosity.
Predicament? What the hey are you talking about?
Twilight snapped back.
Great job, Sunset.
Sunset chastised herself in her mind, realizing she had just made the worst first impression she could have ever made towards the mare before her. But one positive out of the entire endeavor was that she still had Twilight's attention.
Yeah, true.
Therefore,
Could've walked
she
away.
took advantage while the opening was still there. She sighed, calming herself down in hope that she could rebound from her first attempt at making conversation.
Forget what I just said, Twilight.
She said calmly.
I'm not much of a pony for conversation. So this is just as awkward as it seems.
Twilight's eyes went wide with confusion.
How do you know my name?
Twilight questioned.
I don't recall you being in any of my classes or ever associating with you outside of school.
Oh, I'm Princess Celestia's personal protege. I know the names of almost every pony in Canterlot. It's not a requirement, just something you pick up on naturally.
You, Princess Celestia's protege?
Facial
Yeah,
expression.
right.
Perfect.
Twilight replied cynically.
It's true!
Sunset capitalized.
I doubt the ruler of Equestria would put all of her trust into a pony who can't even make conversation with other ponies.
Twilight objected.
Says a pony who talks to her books and has never made any sort of attempt to associate with any pony else.
Sunset lashed back with confidence. Twilight attempted to lash back, but held her words in her throat, realizing that Sunset was right. Upon Twilight's contemplation, Sunset spoke out to Twilight once again.
In fact, I can prove that I'm her protege.
Sunset proposed.
I really like this part of the
Try anything, and I guarantee I can
This
pull it off.
sunset boasting.
Twilight took the mayor's proposition to her advantage,
Yeah, the
and
characters are
decided
written
to
very
see
well
if
by
this pony
Sparrow.
that had approached her out of nowhere could actually hold to her words. Grabbing her notebook where she had written down a list of spells that required very advanced unicorns to perform, she held it out to Sunset.
Perform any of these spells, and then I'll believe you. But be warned, I wrote down only the hardest ones I could find in the book I'm looking over. So it'll take some strong magic skills to pull any of these off.
Sunset eyed the book in Twilight's lap, curious of how advanced this magic really was.
Mind if I see the title of the book you have?
Sunset asked. Twilight rolled her eyes, seeing the mare before her had just completely ignored her proposition. But she didn't argue and lifted the book to where the hardback cover could be seen. Once Sunset saw the cover, she immediately burst into laughter, causing Twilight to grow confused and lost, up until Sunset came out of her fit and spoke.
Oh, please! Those spells are child's play. I mastered those years ago.
Sunset claimed assuredly.
You can't be serious!
Twilight snapped back.
These spells would take years to learn and master.
Well, she said
Some
that
pony
she
like you wouldn't
learned it
even
years
fit
ago.
that area of expertise.
Watch and learn, Philly.
Sunset claimed, taking the notebook in her magic and reading the first spell on the list. Transfiguration. A sudden burst of light blue magic alighted Sunset's
The
horn,
reason why
turning her
Sunset's
focus on a
magic
Sparrow
was
tree
blue
branch
instead of red in this is
next to
because Sparrow
Twilight,
didn't realize that
quickly
the show
being
had,
wrapped in a magical
changed
aura.
Sunset's magic color from
At first,
blue to red
nothing
from
happened,
the first movie
but
to the
then
rest of
Twilight
the
watched
Equestria
as the tree
series.
branch wriggled and morphed into many different forms, eventually taking the form of a red apple, following with a pop. The lavender filly's jaw dropped, eyeing the fruit on the ground.
Okay, Sarah just said that this video
Her
is
stunned
an hour and
gaze
24
turned from the
minutes
apple to the unicorn above her, holding a smug grin on her face with no sign of struggle.
Go on. Try it, and you'll see that I wasn't lying when I said I could perform such an advanced spell.
Sunset proposed. Twilight followed, grabbing the apple in her own magic and taking a small bite out of the fruit. She expected to be met with a rough texture that resembled the bark of a tree and a bland taste, but was amazed as her taste buds danced at the sweet juice caressing the surface of her tongue, its taste devoid of anything she had originally thought. As she chomped down on the shred of the apple that once was a branch, she couldn't believe what she was tasting. Part of her wanted to spit it out, but she didn't, and only continued to chew until it was to the texture of applesauce and gulped it down into her belly. It tasted just like any other regular apple she had eaten in her life.
But how?
Twilight muttered.
I told you, Twilight.
Sunset
I
replied
reused a lot of
nicely.
poses in this
I'm Princess
just to
Celestia's
speed up
protege.
doing the
I know
sequence.
almost any form of magic
I think
that
what
you
I
can
did
name.
worked, though.
Minus the darker forms of magic. The princess told me that those are strictly forbidden, along with any other form of dark magic.
I really like the background.
Twilight
music, too.
couldn't argue. The display of magic she had just witnessed was enough to throw away all doubts on the unicorn before her not being qualified to be her ruler's right hoof mare.
You didn't even break a sweat! Yet I struggle with just a simple light spell! It's not fair! I studied for hours upon hours, but you seem to do it so flawlessly!
Twilight barked. Sunset suddenly felt something spark within her, remembering her early days of learning the simplest forms of magic as much as her struggles. She felt for the filly before her and understood her frustration, so she quickly decided to sympathize with her in a way that she knew Twilight would deem acceptable.
Look, I get it.
Sunset started, resting herself on the ground.
More than you may think.
Twilight looked up, her face holding a look of annoyance.
You don't know anything about me! Up until now, you never even knew I existed! Just
That
leave
is
me
true.
alone!
Sunset had expected this, so she kept her distance. She didn't take the words as an act out of spite. She had been where Twilight currently was in the field of learning magic, how to master it, and trying to find your inner strength to perform it correctly and efficiently. It took more than just reading books and taking notes. This was where Sunset was at the time when she had found her inner strength, then was guided by Celestia in her quest to become a master at magic. The inner spark ignited once again, causing Sunset to act.
Twilight, I've been where you are. Therefore, I know how hard
Sarah
it
did
is.
mention the
Sunset consoled
lineup
nicely.
of the reuse of the
It's going to take
Poses.
more than books to master magic.
perfect. I do see what he's saying.
Trust me. I thought books were the key to meeting the same goal you are trying to reach. But eventually, I learned otherwise.
Twilight's expression changed quickly from annoyed to understanding, but she didn't speak, allowing Sunset to continue.
It took a teacher, a master, some pony that had ascended from student to mentor. For me, that was Princess Celestia. But it didn't happen overnight. It took years of learning, hours of practice, multiple failures before I eventually succeeded, and a lot of confidence in myself. Magic isn't an easy thing to master and requires more than just literature to do so.
Twilight held the same expression, looking at Sunset with unsure eyes.
Where are you going with this?
Twilight asked, unsure. Sunset approached closer, knowing she had Twilight's attention.
Well, If you'd like, I could teach you what I know. I've only shown you a mere fraction of what I can do, and can show you more. But that's up to you,
Sunset's
Philly.
voice has a very tricksy
Sunset
flair
proposed confidently.
to it.
Twilight jumped at the offer. No pony had ever cared or even dared to propose such a mighty
Not that
feat
that's a
with
fair.
her. But here she was, being given such a proposal.
I'm sorry? Did I hear that right? You? Teach me?
Twilight muttered. Sunset nodded.
If you want me to. You and I aren't much different, Twilight. You have the persistence. You just lack the proper needs to accomplish what you seek. I have the knowledge of our fair princess, but only if you want to take this chance will I share it.
Twilight sat, baffled, still unsure if all that she had just heard was fact or fiction. She only knew two things about the mare before her. She was the protege of Princess Celestia, and her magic abilities were miraculous, without a doubt. Yet some pony of such stature was willing to teach her, a struggling student of said matriarch, all she knew about magic and how to properly master it?
What's so special about me that you, the right hoof mare of Princess Celestia, would take time out of her schedule to teach some filly like me such things?
Twilight asked forwardly.
Honestly, I don't know. I guess you could call it unicorn intuition. After all, we both are unicorns.
Sunset responded. Twilight giggled at that, knowing Sunset was joking around. Then she felt something inside of her erupt. A spark of some sort that startled her.
I kind of wish I had
Eyeing
done
Sunset,
more images of
she
this
smiled,
sequence, but
surprising Sunset
It's fine.
as much as the Lavender Filly.
Alright, I'll take your offer.
The sudden confusion made Sunset realize that she had never even properly introduced herself. She wanted to face Hoof herself so hard, but shrugged her self-conflict aside with a heavy sigh, smiling at the filly before her and finding the words to say next.
Oh, I never introduced myself. My name is Sunset Shimmer.
Sunset said sheepishly. Twilight giggled again, hearing the conflict in Sunset's voice. She just held her gaze and responded back to the mare.
It's nice to meet you, Sunset Shimmer. No need for me to introduce myself, seeing as you already know my name.
Twilight proposed. A set of laughter followed between the two, which resorted in the surrounding audience of fellow students, gasping in shock. Twilight Sparkle, the filly
Yes,
who
so
never
cute.
spoke to any pony, unless addressed to do so, associating with the princess's protege. An action that seemed quirky to them, but from beyond the courtyard, Princess Celestia spectated the event unfolding in the courtyard, smiling at the fact that her student had successfully made her first friend.
okay, on to the next chapter.
The day had departed, along with Sunset Shimmer
I gave
returning
art
to
for
her
one
provided
section.
bedchambers, planning to write a report of the day's
But
events,
everything else was done by
mainly her
Lullaby.
meet and
So I'm
befriending
interested
of
to
Twilight
see
Sparkle.
their art. So this art
The
was
two
done
had
by
shared stories in the
Lullaby
many
and
following hours of
Sparrow,
daylight,
so
and had made plans to meet up for lessons on magic, which was hard to arrange accordingly, given Sunset's role as Princess Celestia's protege. She had much to attend within the next couple of weeks, but she had sworn to find an opening in her swamped schedule for her new and only friend. Closing the door to her provided bedroom, she quickly proceeded to laying out a piece of parchment paper on her desk, grabbed a quill and an aura of magic,
Really like
and
these
dipped it
sounds.
into her
They're very
desktop
nice.
inkwell. caressing the writing utensil's tip gently across the surface. She started with a simple introduction, feeling silly that she had to address her mentor even after years of being guided and taught much by said mentor. Giggling to herself in her mind, she continued writing, explaining every little thing that had occurred earlier that day. It didn't take her long to write everything out, her writing pace seeming efficient enough, seeing as she guided the quill with careful focus, she found herself smiling and even making gestures like a giddy filly. It didn't seem to bother her though, and she only continued to write more and more, pauses only being taken in between dips in the inkwell and when she eventually found herself at the bottom of the page. This caught her by surprise.
Wow.
I'm at the bottom already?
She questioned, sketching over the scripture with her bright blue irises. To her surprise, she hadn't realized just how much she had ended up writing, each sentence being full of detail and descriptive terms that would even make the highest professors of Celestia's school bat an eye in awe. She pondered on her actions for a second, but was quickly startled by a sudden set of knocks from her bedroom door.
Come in!
Sunset proposed, rebounding from her overactive nerves still dancing at the sudden knocks. The luminescent golden aura engulfing her door handle immediately gave her assurance on who was behind the thick wooden door as it creaked open and revealed the mighty figure in the doorway.
Princess Celestia! I wasn't expecting you.
Sunset addressed. Celestia merely smiled, walking further into the room and closing the door tightly with her magic. Sunset followed with the action of bowing in the presence of her mentor and matriarch, an action of which that Celestia shooed away with a hoof.
My dear, you need not bow before me.
Celestia cooed.
While I am your princess, you are my most loyal assistant. You are as much as a royal as I am. So there's no need for such gestures in my presence.
Sunset rubbed the back of her neck, smiling and blushing in embarrassment upon her response.
I suppose, I guess.
I suppose you are right. After all, you are the teacher.
Celestia nodded, working further into the room.
I saw that you and Twilight connected well.
Even though I'm an artist
Just
for the
as
program,
I expected
don't
you
know the
would.
script, so I didn't know she was about
Celestia
to say that.
stated.
It could have gone better. But I suppose after we got past all the little nooks and crannies, we really clicked well.
Sunset confirmed.
Lullaby said she's noticing all
Indeed.
the tiny mistakes in her artwork. Yeah, I did too
Celestia
for my
paused,
section as well.
her gaze meeting the
There
massive
are
piece of
extremely
parchment upon the
small
desk
details,
behind
but still
Sunset,
enough for me
as
to
much
notice
as its
and for it to bother
contents.
me, but I didn't say anything because I wasn't.
I see
Trying
you have
not to
reported how the
bring
meeting
attention
between you
to
two
it.
went.
Sunset quickly responded, not wanting to present her
That's the one
mentor
thing
with
about
an
being
incomplete
an artist,
report.
When you notice mistakes in the final product, it
It's not quite
just
finished yet.
feels.
Still need to go
so
over a
irritating.
few other things that we discussed.
Celestia nodded in assurance, continuing
Yeah?
to add the one thing of interest: its length.
I know, we were with
Judging
him!
by the length of your report, you two seem to discuss much. I merely came to check on your progress, and I can see that it's coming along well. I look forward to seeing it complete in the morning.
Sunset smiled, watching as her mentor walked toward the door, turning to face her one last time before her departure.
I'm proud of you, Sunset.
Celestia said in a motherly tone.
I can assure you that you will come to learn more than I could ever teach you from Twilight. Once you're finished, I want you to get some rest. No reading before bed tonight.
Alright.
Sunset replied simply. With that, Celestia turned from Sunset and exited the room, leaving Sunset to finish her assignment. Once the door shut, Sunset turned back to her desk and met the view of the massive piece of literature sprawled out before her. Flipping over the elongated parchment, she dipped the quill into the inkwell once again and proceeded onward, taking careful note not to be so expressive with her wordplay. Otherwise, she might be needing more paper than she had at her leisure.
I like the idea of Sunset getting so carried away that she needs more than one piece of paper.
The following morning was the same as any other day as Sunset rose from her bed, proceeding with her usual everyday morning rituals such as bathing herself, fixing her mane and tail, brushing her teeth, and of course, flossing afterwards. With her mouth, coat, mane, and tail clean and neat, she grabbed her rolled-up report and proceeded down to the dining room where she had breakfast with Celestia every morning. As always upon her arrival, Celestia was seated with a cup of morning coffee nested gently upon a coaster in front of her on the table. Sunset took a seat at the opposite end, resting her assignment upon the table and scooting the large chair closer to the table so she could reach whatever the royal cooks had brewed up for the morning meal. After taking a sip of her coffee and nestling it back onto the coaster, Celestia eyed Sunset nicely, following with a greeting.
Good morning, Sunset.
Number one princess.
Did your night go well?
I like that.
She proposed motherly.
Very. It didn't take long to finish up after you left. I found my writing process to be a lot more consistent than usual.
Sunset replied.
Is that so? Usually you take your time in writing your reports. So what makes this an exception to your usual pace?
Celestia pondered. Off that statement, Sunset realized that the matriarch was being sarcastic, something that both enticed her and made her giggle at the same time in realization. Upon a sudden aura of golden magic levitating her neatly organized homework to the opposite end of the table, Sunset made a remark of her own.
I suppose you can say that, little Philly has inspired me in my writing. Something tells me she has a lavender coat. Oh, and a heavy kink for magic.
The joking caused both mares to burst in mild laughter.
I'm glad you see it the same as I do,
Celestia confessed, bringing her intentions to light.
Now, let's see what you learn in your time with Twilight.
Unrolling the scroll, double-sided with text, Celestia read over the scripture, pausing now and then to take a small sip of coffee. Given the Alicorn's extensive experience in reading over any form of ink-made wording, it only took little time for Celestia to finish up, rolling up the report back to its original form beforehand. Upon one look from Celestia, however, Sunset felt a sudden chill go down her spine.
Why?
I see that you have made a proposition to teach the Philly magical knowledge.
Was
Celestia
she not
said
supposed
calmly.
to?
While I find this good, it also worries me. Do you really
What?
feel like you are up to that sort of a proposition, Sunset? You are proposing a very heavy responsibility that I fear you may not be able to uphold.
Sunset calmed herself, having overreacted upon Celestia's sudden glare after the scripture hiding her face had revealed the image now presented. With a heavy exhalation of breath, she turned her attention back to Celestia, her nerves slowly calming back to a docile state.
Can
Why
the
do you
music
say
calm
that?
down too?
You know that I'm more than capable of performing any spell you've taught me.
Sunset asked. Celestia paused, taking another sip of her morning drink. After settling the cup back onto the coaster, she answered to Sunset's questions.
I don't doubt your magical abilities, my student.
Celestia
So, what's
started
the
with a
problem?
hint of reassurance.
However, it takes more than magical experience to teach another such abilities. Especially somebody as fascinated with magic as Twilight.
That comment took Sunset aback. She wasn't sure what to think about it. Twilight was a filly. She was clearly the successor over a pony nearly half her age. So what did Celestia mean by all that she had just said? She had taken it as her mentor claiming that Twilight had more experience and skill with magic than she did, and that was enough to make her pause.
Are you saying that Twilight, a filly, has more magical abilities than me? A Gromare?
Sunset stated with confusion.
Yes and no. While
And
Twilight
no?
is indeed a filly, and you are much older and mature than she is, I have had my eye on Twilight for some time, and have seen differences in her magical abilities from the regular unicorn. Differences that you may not be able to withstand or control on your own, Sunset.
Celestia responded with mild strictness.
Okay, what's with
I'm
all the
not
vagaries?
sure I understand, Princess. What kind of differences?
Sunset pleaded mildly, now unsure of whether or not she wanted to go through with her proposition towards Twilight.
I'm afraid it's not easy to explain, my dear. I only say these things for your own safety. Shall you choose to go through with this? All I ask is that you're careful in just what you teach the filly. She's more talented than you may think.
Celestia confirmed.
This art
Sunset
is really
paused
beautiful,
again,
by the way.
thinking deeply and slowly starting to piece Celestia's words together. Eventually she began to understand her mentor's words, and took it upon herself to memorize them well. All unicorns are different, and Twilight, although she was a filly, was no exception to that concern.
I understand, Princess. You are right in one way, but in another way, I feel like I should at least try to guide her. Don't worry, I'll start out with something simple and see if I can't spot these differences that you've spotted.
Sunset clarified gently.
I'm sorry for all the
Celestia
background
nodded.
noise if you can hear that. My
So be
family's
it
talking
then.
in the hallway.
Just remember what I said here, and be careful.
I will.
Sunset confirmed as she caught sight of the cooks bringing out multiple plates of food from the kitchen. She was presented with a massive stack of pancakes with a side of toast and a pot containing sweet maple syrup. As she grabbed her breakfast and placed it on her provided plate, she thought hard about all that Celestia had said, plaguing her mind with it by replaying them over and over like a broken record. She didn't know what to expect in her first meeting with the filly, but it was best to say that it was going to be an experience unlike any other.
Okay, on to the next section. And according to Sparrow, the art in this section is by Little Blue Lynx.
Sunset had found an opening within the following week, and using the provided journal that all of Celestia's students were gifted to keep in touch with fellow students, she and Twilight had met up in the Canterlot Castle courtyard again. Sunset had decided to read up on lower-level spells for the occasion, just in case the lesson had gone any longer than she had intended. Regardless, she had a plan set for their first meet together as teacher and student, and as promised, Sunset kept Celestia's words of wisdom in her mind. Twilight had already arrived when Sunset had exited the castle, catching the filly waiting patiently from atop the staircase that led from the castle into the pastures of trees, grass, and vegetation. She had expected this, having done the same in her years of being taught by Celestia. It never earned her any sort of extra credit, but she didn't mind, being more interested in the knowledge than any sort of reward. The reward was being one step closer to becoming a master of magic, and that was enough for her. Pacing herself across the courtyard, Sansa came to meet the filly, being greeted accordingly.
Good day, Mentor Sunset.
Twilight said, with
Mentor
utmost
Sunset.
giddiness.
I like that.
Sunset couldn't help but giggle, feeling out of place in the endeavor.
Sunset is fine, Twilight. No need to address me as anything fancy.
Sunset assured.
Sorry. I was always told to address any pony of higher stature properly.
Twilight confessed.
No need to apologize. It's good that you were taught to do so. But we're friends, so we should treat each other as we normally would in any other case.
Sunset stated.
Makes
Got it.
sense.
So, what are you going to be teaching me today?
Twilight finalized, changing the subject. Again, Sunset wasn't shocked, knowing that Twilight was a very curious and anxious filly, so her hasty questioning didn't seem out of place one bit.
We're going to start with figuring out what needs to be addressed with your current knowledge on magic. Before we can start even thinking about learning spells.
I do find it interesting
Your preliminary
when artists
actions
use
must
more
be
of a
addressed,
realistic horse
along with your
design for
posture
these
and etiquette.
characters.
Sunset explained nicely. Twilight raised an eyebrow, unsure of what Sunset was trying to make her understand. Sunset caught this and resorted to explaining the matter in a way a filly her
Bear
age
said that
would
this
understand.
section has lots of inspiration from the Guru.
Basically,
the Guru
we need
episode
to
of
figure out
Atla.
if you are doing anything wrong that
I don't know
impacts
what
how
that
you do
is.
proper magic casting.
Oh.
Twilight mused, now understanding the aspect. Sunset made her way in front of Twilight so that both teacher and student were in tune with one another.
So, let's start off with you showing me how you go about casting a spell.
Twilight nodded, then proceeded to getting into her usual position whenever she attempted to cast any spell in the past. Spreading her forearms and forelegs apart, Twilight proceeded to what seemed like a culmination of massive struggle and expressions that no pony usually made in a public environment. Groans and heavy breathing followed in between the filly's attempt to spark her horn to life with magical
I really
energy.
like the way Twilight's
But
tail
they all
looks
failed,
in this spell.
and Sunset had already spotted flaws in Twilight's posture. Critical mistakes that explained why she wasn't even getting any sort of magical energy to manifest from her horn.
That'll do, Twilight.
Sunset commanded, waving her hoof as a gesture to seize her actions. Twilight listened and stopped her fruitless attempts, breathing heavily and planting her flank on the grassy surface she stood upon.
What am I doing wrong?
She pouted in irritation.
You're trying too hard.
Sunset explained clearly, causing the filly to wince in curiosity and interest.
Magic isn't something you can force out of you. It's something that must be guided very carefully. Unicorn magic comes from the inner core of their being, and only if it's channeled correctly can it arise from within.
Sunset paused for a brief glance at Twilight to make
It
sure
sorta
she
makes
wasn't
me,
confusing the lavender filly. One glance, and she saw that
Sort
Twilight
of makes me
had
think
taken
of
full
when
understanding
Starlight was
and
teaching
interest
Trixie
at her
how to do
teachings.
a
Her head
transfiguration
high,
spell,
ears perked,
and how she
and
said
eyes
personally
focused
for
on
her,
only
her
her.
magic is tied to her emotions.
With that
while
assurance,
for someone like
she
Twilight, it
continued.
might just be sheer determination.
Like your soul, magic is a part of you. But to channel it, it takes more than just intense focus. There are many factors that play into bringing your magical energy to the surface. Everything that is a part of you must be in sync with it. Because, like I said, it is a part of you. Therefore, all that is part of you must be connected with your magic as well. Only then can your magic connect to the main energy source that powers it.
My horn?
Twilight guessed.
Yes.
Sunset replied with a smile, continuing further.
Sorry for the typing. I was telling
The
somebody
horn is
that
the part of
who
every
was,
unicorn that connects
giving
with
me
their
credit
core,
for the Sunset
body,
voice, and I
soul.
did not voice
It's
Sunset or
connected
anyone
to every
in this
layer
project.
of the unicorn's being. their strengths, weaknesses,
Writing
and
Alex
emotions.
918 was the voice of Sunset.
Twilight was
and
beyond
afterwards I'll look at the
fascinated
description
by
and
all
give
of this
off
information,
the list of all
never
of the
realizing
VAs
just
and
how
artists that
important
were
a unicorn's
involved
horn
in
really
this.
was, along with the fact that it was like the epicenter of their body.
That explains why a unicorn loses the ability to perform any magic after so long. If the magic is connected to their strength, then any time you perform a massive amount of magic, you use a large amount of your physical strength as well.
Twilight exclaimed in astonishment.
Exactly, Twilight!
Sunset exclaimed herself, amazed at just how well Twilight was catching on to the lesson.
Only when your magical energy is in tune with your being can it connect to the horn and be used at your leisure.
So, how exactly do you do that?
Twilight asked curiously.
That's what we're going to be working on first. Before you can channel your magical energy, you must know the proper preliminary actions to do said action. It's not something you will be able to learn in one try, and will more than likely take multiple lessons to learn naturally. Only then will we even attempt channeling your magical energy to your horn.
Sunset answered.
How long did it take before you were ready?
Twilight asked.
About 2 months.
2 months?
But remember,
Wow.
every unicorn is different, so it may be possible that you'll learn the preliminaries naturally in less time than I did. Or it may take longer than it took me. It's all in who you are and your will to learn the skill.
Twilight wanted to pout at that, but she understood and stored everything Sunset had told her in her memory banks.
I understand,
Stored in
Sunset
memory
Shimmer.
banks.
Twilight
I don't know why
assured.
that made me laugh. Just the wording.
Where do I start?
Sunset smiled at Twilight's understanding, proceeding further with the lesson.
Well, now that you've shown me where the problems that we need to address lie, it's time for you to watch and observe. I'm going to do the proper preliminaries for casting a spell now, and I want you to tell me what you notice that is different from your attempts.
All right. My eyes are open.
Twilight agreed.
Very good.
Billy Twilight is great in
Now.
this.
Watch carefully.
Sunset stated nicely. Twilight didn't blink, watching as Sunset got into a position much like her own, and with all of her senses keen to the demonstration, the filly observed Sunset's lessons very carefully. The first thing she caught was that there was no struggling involved, and instead, her mentor was surprisingly calm and mellow in her stance, something she noted as she continued to observe the mare before her. Like a spotlight, Twilight's gaze highlighted Sunset and only Sunset, as she saw the appendage sticking out from her fiery mane become emblazoned with a light blue aura, encasing the horn and
Sparrow said
circling
he was
it in a
tempted to
repeated
put bacon
pattern.
mane instead of fiery
This
mane.
action repeated, up until Sunset retracted the magical energy and reassembled her regular posture, her gaze meeting the lavender filly's own violet irises.
So, what differences did you notice?
Sunset addressed.
Well, there was no sign of struggle, and you were calm and unfazed the entire process.
Twilight replied, her teacher nodding as a response.
Very good, Twilight. You spotted the most critical aspect of casting or performing magic. Just like any other task, such as eating or walking, you must be calm and not stiff. This leads to the next part of the lesson. Proper etiquette when casting a spell.
Filly was already intrigued, so Sunset wasted no time and continued onward. Now the lesson had truly started.
Stance, posture, and etiquette are all key to casting a spell correctly and efficiently, my friend. You did have the proper stance, but everything that followed was wrong. Your assumption was that if you struggle hard enough, magic will spark from your horn, when in reality, all that'll do is give you a massive headache and burst blood vessels. The true way to cast a spell is to calm your body and let the magic flow naturally. The first step to keeping yourself calm is to breathe naturally at your usual pace. Lack of oxygen is one of the easiest ways to send your body into a state of panic, feeling like you can't breathe. Slow and steady breaths are what you want to do in the case of casting or performing magic. You want casting and performing magic to feel like a natural thing, not as something that is outside of your ability as a unicorn. As natural as eating, sleeping, walking, basically any natural function you do in your everyday life. Second is posture. You want your airway to be as open as possible, so your breaths can repeat in an equal and calm pattern. Therefore, your body should be narrow, your hooves spread apart, but steady enough, and your head up to where your airway is straight and not constricted. With this posture, your body is calm and you are able to remain calm.
This is a very detailed lesson, wow.
Lastly is the most important part of calming your body. Calming your mind while
That's
still
one thing I
maintaining
like about
focus.
Sparrow's stories is that they're very
If you
detail
follow the
oriented.
proper
I feel like
etiquette that I
the
just
average
advised, this step is
writer would have
already being
just cut out
accomplished.
the lesson part and just like had a
While performing
synopsis of
magic,
the first lesson
your mind
went
must
well.
have focus.
Twilight struggled a little bit, but
Focus
she was
is the
making
key to
improvements.
controlling a spell
type
and
of,
keeping your magic tamed. But
type
we'll
of
discuss that when
narration.
you actually manage to channel your magic to your core and horn.
Understood.
Twilight agreed, still intrigued and fascinated by the information and teachings of her friend.
Good. Now, I want you to try again. But this time, I want you to do your best to follow the steps I just taught you.
Sunset replied.
Okay. I'll do my best, Sunset.
Twilight agreed. Sunset nodded, watching her student with observant eyes as she proceeded forward with the command she had given. Twilight spread her legs apart to the point of where she
Sparrow
could
said
still
that the art
stand
in
without
this
feeling
section is done
clumsy,
by Angel
closed her
101.
eyes, and held her head high to where her airway was no longer constricted, doing her best to breathe normally and isolate her mindset to only her reason for doing these actions. For a while, nothing happened, but Sunset still observed Twilight like a predator waiting to pounce on its prey, and was honestly shocked on how well Twilight was managing on her
I don't
first
know
attempt
why, but
at
that
proper magic casting
simile
etiquette.
was very unsimilar.
Twilight had begun to feel the same, feeling her body fall into a natural rhythm like her friend and teacher had explained earlier in the lesson. She wondered if she should stop, but just kept the stance, preferring to wait until Sunset advised her to stop. Many minutes passed, and the natural flow continued to envelop Twilight's small body, not even aware that her mind had met the demands of her mentor as well, being calm and unfazed by any of her surroundings. A breeze blew, but Twilight remained focused. She was as still as a statue, unmoved by nature, and by the time Sunset finally told her to stop, it had been a time period of 20 minutes.
Wow.
That's enough, Twilights. You can stop now.
Sunset commanded. As instructed, Twilight came out of the posture and eyed her mentor with curious eyes.
How did I do?
Twilight asked.
Fantastic! Definitely not what I expected out of a first attempt.
Sunset answered. Sunset's response came out as if she had just discovered an ancient equestrian artifact, which caught Twilight's attention.
Did I do something wrong?
Twilight mused.
No, she's just impressed.
No. You exceeded my expectations. In fact, I think that's a good place to end the lesson. You've learned enough for one day. And once you get down the entire concept of the etiquettes, we'll work on channeling your magic. In the meantime, just keep practicing that same posture in your spare time, and we'll pick up on it during our next lesson.
Sunset replied. Sunset felt as if she were speaking nonsense, considering what she had just experienced. A filly had just performed proper magic etiquette as if it were nothing more than filly's play. She was beginning to understand what Celestia had meant by Twilight having differences in terms of magical abilities. This attempt wasn't just a fluke or beginner's luck.
Everything okay, Sunset?
Twilight sympathized. Sunset hadn't realized just how obvious she had made her thoughts on Twilight's overly progressive first attempt visible on her face, causing her to cuss at herself in her mind.
Yeah, everything is fine, Twilight. I guess you could say I'm just impressed at your first attempt. And the fact that I know our lessons together are going to be interesting. I have much to report to Princess Celestia about you and your progress.
Twilight smiled as a result, feeling for the first time in her short life she had succeeded at something she had been studying and trying to accomplish for years.
It's nice seeing Twilight.
To further express her gratitude
progress
and excitement, she embraced her mentor and friend in a tight hug, surprising Sunset at first, but once she realized what was happening, she just returned to the kind act with her hooves wrapping around the filly that was her student. Releasing the hug, the two mares departed, returning to their respective homes within the city. Sunset had much to write and report on this session, and Twilight had more practicing to do. With every step she took, all Sunset could feel was a warmth and sense of accomplishment. Something she hadn't felt since her enrollment as Princess Celestia's protege, and she knew deep down that as these lessons continued, things were only going to get all the more interesting if that day's events were only one sample of what her student was capable of. The lessons had continued, along with Sunset relaying the filly's progression in magic after each of them to Princess Celestia. And within only a year of lessons between the two mares, Twilight had become attuned with her magical abilities.
Yeah,
the following lesson had focused on Twilight channeling her magic from her core to her horn, and while it did take a few hours, the filly had achieved the goal of the session.
It gives a bit more character to the
lavender unicorn had begun to grow into a master. Sunset was amazed at Twilight's progress, seeing she had achieved her goals rather quickly, something that not most unicorns accomplish so easily. It had taken her years to get to where Twilight had grown within only a few months, but she didn't see it as anything abnormal or anything to get jealous over. If anything, she was more proud than anything else, especially considering how the two had met, and now they were nearly inseparable as mentor and student. Sunset had learned much in her time teaching Twilight as well, both about her student and herself. She had learned what Celestia had intended from the start. There's more to life than just studying on something she had become a master at. And in her time with Twilight, she had come to see that mentoring others in something and guiding them to become masters at it was a thrilling sensation that she couldn't explain. It was a wholesome feeling, and over the time she had been teaching Twilight, she never thought she would come to develop such a close bond with a filly nearly half her age. All she knew was one thing: her student and friend would grow to be a master of sorcery, and she couldn't be more proud. However, there were some that saw Twilight's learning progression as something more malevolent and potentially a sign of danger. Especially after what had happened when Twilight earned her cutie mark. Celestia had grown curious on just how advanced Twilight's magical abilities had become, so she decided to test them. Sunset saw it as odd, but figured it was also a good way to see for herself just how far her student had come in her lessons, and as a good mentor would act, encouraged her student to take on the challenge. The whole endeavor was pretty simplistic. All Twilight had to do was perform spells accordingly, the range of spells going from simple to more advanced. Depending on how Twilight's experience was, determined just how good of a magician she was at that current time. The result was unlike anything Equestria had ever seen.
I guess we're on to the next chapter or segment.
I'm not sure
of
if I
the
can
story.
do this, Sunset. I've never had to perform spells in such succession before, and with the princess watching, it just makes me more nervous.
Twilight said with worry in her voice. Sunset stood before her anti-student, trotting in circles in a frazzled manner. She could feel where Twilight was coming from in the moment, seeing she had been here before. It was nerve-wracking to be put in such a position, so she knew she had to reassure her student for her to succeed.
Twilight, look at me.
Sunset said with mild sternness, catching Twilight's attention.
The audio quality is
You need to calm down if you even want to have a chance at succeeding. Remember our first lesson together?
Twilight nodded.
Good. Then what is the main thing that you need to be in order to cast spells accordingly?
Sunset assured. Twilight let out a long breath she had been holding unintentionally.
I need to be calm in both my body and mind.
Correct.
Sunset confirmed, then smiled down at her student.
Okay, this
Don't
art is
think
by
of this as a challenge,
ViolarulesReacts again.
but more as any other lesson with me. Just picture yourself in the courtyard with me guiding you on how to cast the spells. I'll be watching you from the stands, and if anything goes wrong, then just yell something as an alert and I'll get you out. Okay?
Another long sigh escaped Twilight's mouth as she looked up to her best friend and mentor with all the confidence she could possibly have expressed.
Okay. I'll do my best.
She muttered softly, with a slight shakiness in her voice.
Now there's the Twilight I know. Keep that attitude in mind and you'll succeed with no trouble.
Sunset stated with confidence. Twilight smiled and hugged Sunset as an assurance before they parted ways. Sunset returned the hug, then with one final smile, she left Twilight to go join Celestia and company within the stands. With a deep breath and long exhalation, Twilight walked forward into what seemed like a massive coliseum. She eyed the stands as she walked to the center of the massive structure, noticing Celestia, Sunset, and some other fellow company with clipboards and pencils placed behind their ears, seated. Once she was in the center of the room, she stopped and waited for any further instructions. Silence filled the sound waves for a moment before she was addressed by Princess Celestia herself.
Twilight Sparkle, you will be tested on your magical knowledge, starting from the simplest of sorcery to some of the most advanced and difficult of spells that most unicorns cannot handle.
Celestia confirmed, continuing.
Your magical ability will be judged by your response time to the spell you are tasked with, and your mental and physical state in between casting these spells. If at any time you feel like you are unable to perform or hold a spell, alert us immediately, and we will stop the challenge. Are you ready?
Twilight nodded as response, signaling for the challenge to begin.
Okay. I guess
Very
by
well.
light spell they mean just
We will
lighting
start
up
with
your
a
horn.
simple spell. Please perform a general light spell.
Celestia assured. Twilight didn't see this as a challenge, and with a flicker of magical energy upon her horn, she cast a light spell with ease, holding it just in case it was necessary to impress what she assumed were judges.
Well done, Twilight. Please release the spell.
Celestia said nicely. Twilight followed, suppressing her focus and allowing the light spell to shimmer out.
How difficult
She
will
didn't
it
get comfortable, though, knowing that this challenge was far from over, and the spells were only going to get more hard as she continued forward.
Your response time was excellent, and your current state is stable.
Levitation.
We will now proceed to the next spell. Please
bit more
perform a
advanced, but
levitation
not
spell on the
much.
objects that will be presented to you. Timing will start once the spell is cast.
Celestia said. Twilight awaited the objects to manifest before her, but was surprised to see them being wheeled in on a long cart by another unicorn. Upon the cart were 3 objects: an apple, a table, and a large boulder twice her size. She grew nervous about the boulder, wondering if she even had the strength to lift something of that size and weight. Sunset saw this too, finding it strange that for a level 2 spell challenge, it was something of this magnitude. She didn't say anything though, and only watched in anticipation as the challenge started. With careful focus, Twilight engulfed the apple in a magic aura and levitated it with ease. It remained airborne for a few seconds, then she released the delicious fruit, settling it back on the cart gently. Next came the table, which she quickly blanketed with her magenta magic and proceeded to lifting it from its surface upon the cart.
I'm glad that he added that the table.
Upon lifting the wooden table, Twilight had begun to struggle, having never lifted something of this size in any of Sunset's lessons regarding levitation. She had only ever lifted simple things like sticks and small rocks, never something of such heft like a solid wooden table. She was about to call it quits, up until she remembered what Sunset had told her before entering the room.
Don't think of this as a challenge, but more as any other lesson with me.
In this image that's on screen right now, the art is by Wolf Draw.
Me guiding you on how to cast the spells.
While it costed her time, she didn't have any other choice. Closing her eyes and putting herself in a setting of the Canterlot courtyard with Sunset's voice guiding her in the spell. It worked perfectly, as she felt the table start to lift from the cart, increasing the heft by a ton, but she just kept her focus and kept her mindset within the same setting of the meeting place where she and Sunset engaged in magical lessons. The table remained airborne for a few seconds, then with ease, Twilight placed the table back upon the cart. Her success had caught the attention of all in attendance, shocked that a filly of her size had succeeded in something that most fillies would never be able to do. It wasn't easy in the slightest, but regardless of the difficulty, Twilight remained focused on the task at hoof. Her gaze turned to the massive boulder that she had yet to lift, trying to keep her breathing and body calm. She knew it was going to take all of her strength to accomplish this feat, so she just focused her magic on the boulder, quickly becoming encased in her magic aura, and lifted. Immediately, the magic aura shimmered out, and Twilight fell back on the ground with a grunt. The weight of the boulder had caused her to lose focus almost immediately, feeling as if her magical energy had ricocheted backwards and hit her with a force so powerful that it had caused her to lose nearly all of her physical strength. Sunset became worried in the mix of the challenge and eyed her student, struggling to get up from the ground from the result of the impact she had taken. Sunset wanted to say something, but she didn't want to jump to expectations and gave a moment to see what would happen next.
No! I can't give up now!
Twilight chastised to herself. Regaining her balance and breathing heavily, Twilight once again refocused her magic on the boulder. The massive object grew closed in a magic aura once again, and with all of her focus, Twilight proceeded to lifting the giant rock. The monolith shook upon the cart, the magical energy fading in and out in between Twilight's groans and heavy breaths. The shaking suddenly began to cause the audience to stir in bewilderment, looking upon a filly on the verge of performing a task no filly had ever succeeded in. But just as soon as the awe and shock came, it left all the same, Twilight falling back on her flank once again.
Oh no.
The boulder had become unstable, and as a result, the monolith had begun to fall from the cart right in the direction of Twilight, unstable and physically unable to respond. The horror had begun to unfold at a fast pace as the scene played out like a culmination of creeping death. Sunset saw it first and didn't hesitate to act in response. She attempted to focus her magic on the rock, but for some reason found her magical energy blocked off. She tried recasting multiple times, but it was no use.
I like the echo
And in the stir of the
there.
moment, all she could do was yell.
I guess because it's taking place in a coliseum, is that the reason for the reverb?
Get out of the way!
Sunset shouted as loud as possible. Twilight merely heard the words, and only managed to turn and see the inevitable end for her. The giant beast of a rock creeped downward, closing in on her like a giant maw of a beast engulfing her. She wanted to scream, but found she couldn't, and only one thing came to her in a sudden onset of memories. She had to save herself. The boulder was inches from killing her when she acted in quick succession, and in one last-ditch effort, focused her magic again on the object that filled her vision. The magical energy stirred around the giant maw, and Twilight pushed as hard as her body's strength could muster
I do like the music
upward.
in this section.
The boulder didn't seem like it was even going to budge, but Twilight didn't give up and just continued to push with all of her might. The audience had come to terms that the filly was doomed, and Sunset had fallen to tears. But upon a glance, her tears receded, watching in unbelievable awe and shock at the sight of the boulder, airborne. Engulfed in a bright and luminescent magenta light, the monolith that was moments away from ending Twilight's life remained in the air, a struggling filly holding her own in a mix of unlimited drama, horror, and sadness. But this wasn't the same as any other time Twilight had cast a spell. This was different. Her horn was aglow with unbelievable fiery magical light, and her body surrounded by a light unlike anything Ponykind had ever saw. She was still in control, and the boulder only continued to levitate higher and higher. Sunset and the others could only watch the phenomenon in complete shock and horror at what they were witnessing, and it only grew more and more astonishing as the light engulfing Twilight grew brighter and brighter. Then it happened. Magical surges began to pulsate from the filly's horn, each of them resembling an aftershock of an earthquake.
I also like how this
fiery beams shot outward
Twilight
as well,
got
striking
her
the
key mark
stands
in the
and
show,
slowly but
sort of
surely
warped it for the
destroying
story.
them. Every pony within the stands didn't hesitate and quickly
this artist by
evacuated their seated
92,
areas, running to the nearest exit. All except Sunset, who took the liberty of running to her friend's aid. She just ran endlessly until she was at Twilight's side, and only placed a hoof upon the filly's shoulder within an aura of emblazoned light. She didn't care if she got hurt anymore. She just wanted her friend and student safe. Upon the contact with Sunset's hoof, Twilight turned to face her mentor, and immediately calmed, releasing the boulder from its magical prison and the magical light fading away. Sunset worked quick to get Twilight out of the way of the descending boulder, not risking her magic not being able to save them. She grabbed the filly and trotted quickly out of the way of the monolith, hearing it hit the ground with a massive boom. Both mares breathed heavily in fear and relief, standing up and looking at the massive object that had collided onto the surface of the Coliseum. It would have easily crushed both of them had it not been for quick action in the moment of impact. Neither of them spoke, and only hugged in relief that the horror show was over, but knew that there was many questions needed to be answered. The whole endeavor only grew more mysterious upon one glance upon Twilight's flank, where a cutie
drawing this one
now
was hard because
resided.
there's not a lot of
Instead of celebration,
hugging
All that
images from
followed
the show.
was looks of absolute confusion, horror, relief,
Phillies being
and
hugged, so I
wonder.
sort of had to.
It only grew
go
worse
off of
upon
what I could
Celestia's
find.
intrusion on the moment of many mixed emotions.
I don't know what to say.
Celestia muttered. Sunset eyed Celestia with fiery eyes, knowing that there was more to this than Celestia was saying. A number of things didn't make sense, and she intended to find out the truth behind said matters.
Twilight, you go with the guards. Princess Celestia, I'd like to speak with you in private.
Sunset ordered. Celestia winced at the command.
Very well, Sunset.
Yeah, it's not
Twilight
your
only
fault.
shivered in fear.
I'm sorry. I didn't mean to.
Sunset hushed Twilight.
We know, Twilight, and none of this is your fault. Go with the Royal Guard. They'll escort you to safety.
Twilight bowed her head, then proceeded to following the Royal Guard out of the building. Once the coast was clear, Sunset turned to Celestia with a look of rage.
Mind explaining why this happened, Your Highness?
Sunset questioned indignantly. Celestia jumped at the accusation and followed up.
Yeah, that does sound like something Celestia would
I
be
don't
able to
understand,
do.
Sunset.
Don't lie! Who else can block magical energy from being cast?
Sunset snapped back.
What are you talking about, Sunset?
Celestia replied with slight hurt in her voice. Sunset drew in closer to further express her current emotions.
I tried to save Twilight from the boulder by lifting it with my own magic, but for some odd reason, my magic was blocked. And if it weren't for Twilight's will to live, she would have died!
Sunset paused before continuing further with more accusations.
Another thing! Who the buck
That
gives
is
a
true.
filly a boulder to levitate? You knew very well that Twilight was still lifting small objects, because you read my reports.
Celestia's tone grew more firm in her response.
It was to push her harder, Sunset. A filly must be pushed if she's ever going to succeed.
You never pushed me that hard! I don't know what kind of sick game you were playing today, but I know it was you! No pony else in the room was capable to block spellcasting! Except you!
That sounds like an excuse.
Sunset exclaimed.
Did you ever stop to think that Twilight's sudden magical surge may have had something to do with it?
Twilight wasn't even in that state when I first tried to save her. Stop making excuses and admit that you planned all of this! Are you jealous that I have my own student? Is that why you tried to kill her?
A pause followed those words, and in that time, Celestia's demeanor had changed,
ViolarulesReacts
and
also did
Sunset
this
felt
section.
a chill go down her spine at the sight of her once mentor.
You must understand, Sunset. I never intended to hurt you. I had set you up at Twilight to extinguish a problem that I had seen coming for a long time. Twilight is powerful. Too powerful. We all witnessed it today. She is a threat to Equestria.
Yeah, Liora did a very good
And
job
I
with
would have
this
hoped you
piece
would
of
have
art.
seen it before this all happened. Her
Oh,
power exceeds my
I
own.
forgot that
and
that
is
was
just
a plot
simply
point
something
of
I
this
cannot
story.
condone within my kingdom. It's the same reason why I killed my sister.
That quote made Sunset's blood run cold. For the longest time, she had thought that the tale of the Mare and the Moon was true, but now hearing this, she was speechless and baffled in complete horror. It only got worse as Celestia continued.
Luna had hidden potential, and I had seen it from day one. The whole story of the Mare on the Moon is just a cover-up for what really happened that night. Starsworld had always looked upon Luna, and was even going to work on helping her unleash the full potential she had hidden inside of her. I was always the failure. The one who could never get anything right. The one who always slaved over their wants and needs. I grew tired of it, and got rid of the only obstacle in my path to becoming a ruler.
Celestia does not care.
How could you do that? She was
This one
your
was by
sister.
Hocus Pocus.
Sunset's voice had fallen to a near whisper.
Hocus Pocus also did 2 pieces of art
what
earlier.
I had to do to rule.
Towards the beginning
No
of Twilight
pony,
reading the book and
especially a
Sunset
filly, was
smiling
going to destroy
awkwardly
what
at
I
her with
forced
the
to
sun
become.
behind her. Those are by
That's why I
Hocus
needed
Pocus as
you,
well.
Sunset. You and I are not much different, so I figured you see the danger that Twilight threatened to our rule. You saw it yourself. Her hidden potential has been realized, but she has no idea how to harness such power. We must stop her from becoming greater than both you and I.
Celestia's tone had grown more malevolent. Sunset shivered in absolute fear and disgust. She had no idea what she was witnessing, and just wanted to wake up from the twisted dream she had fallen into. She blinked multiple times, but nothing happened.
Pretty Pegasus
Celestia
Wings was
only
the voice
capitalized off of
Celestia
that.
and did an amazing job.
My dear protege, why do
Our
you
rule?
resist?
What?
Don't become one of them. Not when we're so close to running a threat to our rule.
Celestia cooed. Sunset's voice was shaky.
What are you talking about?
Celestia followed up with a giggle that made every speck of fur on Sunset's body stand up straight.
Do you think that you are my first and only protege? Dear Sunset, I've had many other proteges in my lifetime as the ruler of Equestria, but unfortunately, they were all the same in the end. They all resisted me, and I had to rid the problematic unicorns that have found their way into my school on my own.
So it doesn't really make sense,
Don't
because if
be like them, Sunset.
Celestia would kill
Take
Luna
your place by my side on the
because
throne
she
and
didn't want
destroy
anybody
Twilight
getting in the way of her
Sparkle.
rule, why would she be okay with Sunset ruling by her side?
Sunset
But I guess
had
it's just
no
to get
idea what
Sunset
to
to
do.
do what she wants.
She knew she couldn't run, use magic, or resist. She just stood in absolute horror at the realization that her former mentor was a crazed murderer, and didn't hesitate to bring any pony down to keep her title as Princess Celestia clean. She was in a temporary state of shock and fear, and all she could do was stand in absolute horror.
So, my dear, what will it be? You know you can't use magic, because I can block it with ease. And you can't outrun me or outsmart me, because I taught you everything you know. So, will you become one with the other proteges that have failed me? Or will you be smart and fall through with killing Twilight Sparkle?
I don't even know who you are anymore! How could you be so heartless and disgraceful to the very subjects that you were supposed to protect and guide?
Sunset exclaimed. Celestia followed with a chuckle, her demeanor no longer the usual motherly and kind
extremely
princess she usually
psychopathic,
held.
yeah.
All that stood before
This
Sunset's
artwork by
gaze
Hocus
now
Pocus, though,
was a
is
sinister
amazing. I
and
love it.
psychopathic alicorn, eyeing her with a look of malevolence and pure evil.
Dear Sunset, have you not
Getting
learned
strong
anything?
Daybreaker vibes from that line.
If you wish to rule, you must destroy any who stand in your way, and eliminate any who threaten to ruin all that you have worked so hard to gain!
Celestia questioned with indignance. Sunset wanted to vomit. She had no idea what to do, and scavenged her thoughts for any spells that may free her from this inescapable proposition that she knew had nothing but a grim ending for her. She dug into the deepest resources of her mind for anything that could aid her in this situation.
I will not ask again, Sunset. Are you going to aid me in destroying Twilight, or will I have to do it myself?
Celestia spoke with demented sternness. Sunset knew that exclamation was no bluff. Celestia was dead serious, and it was now or never. She had to decide between killing her friend or joining the other protégés in death. Sunset trailed off, bracing herself for the worst.
Yes?
Celestia questioned, knowing
Okay,
she
so
had Sunset pinned in a position
this is the point where
she couldn't
the
escape.
two endings come into play. And what I'll do is, in my end card, I'll do the same thing Sparrow did, where he gives you the choice of never or I'll do it. So you decide Sunset's fate, and depending on what you want to do, those will be the two end cards for you, because I don't want this video to get too long. It's already really long. But yeah, I really like this story, and I hope that you guys like the endings as well. They're very interesting. But I'm going to leave this episode here, and I'll see you guys in one of the two endings, or maybe you'll watch both. But either way, hope that you guys have a happy Halloween, and I'll talk to you guys next time.